Jake, a middle-aged man with a past he'd rather forget, is driving home from a business trip on a lonely road when his car suddenly breaks down. The rain is coming down in sheets, and his phone has no signal. He decides to seek shelter in an abandoned house he noticed earlier on the road. As Jake steps inside, he's greeted by the musty smell of decay and the distant rumble of thunder. He lights a few candles he finds scattered around the house, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the corner of the living room, he discovers an old, dusty radio sitting on a table. On a whim, he tries to turn it on, but it only emits static. As Jake settles in for what he expects to be a long night, the radio suddenly crackles to life. A news anchor's voice cuts through the static, reporting on a brutal murder that has just occurred nearby. The details are disturbingly vivid: a woman in her 30s, strangled to death in her own home. As Jake listens, a chill runs down his spine when the anchor announces that the killer is still on the loose. Suddenly, Jake hears the sound of footsteps outside the house. Terrified, he rushes to lock the doors and windows, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain is deafening, but he can still hear the footsteps growing closer. He grabs a rusty fireplace poker, the only weapon he can find, and stands by the door, ready to defend himself. The radio static fades, and the anchor's voice returns. This time, it's different, calmer, more sinister. The voice describes the inside of the house Jake is in, as if the anchor can see him. It mentions the fireplace poker, the locked doors, and finally, Jake himself, standing terrified by the door, and now, the killer is inside the house. Jake's breath catches in his throat as he realizes the anchor isn't describing a recent event but a future one. Suddenly, he hears the creak of the door behind him. He turns around, only to be confronted by his own reflection in the window. It's then that he remembers, years ago, he had killed someone in a fit of rage. The radio isn't just predicting the future, it's showing him his own twisted reality. Jake was the killer all along, and the radio was warning him of his fate. The footsteps he heard were his own, echoing in his mind as he finally succumbs to his guilt, realizing he's been trapped in a loop of his own making, destined to relive this night over and over. Sarah is an ambitious photographer with a keen eye for the unusual. On her way back from a disappointing photo shoot, she gets caught in a fierce rainstorm. The only shelter nearby is a small, isolated cabin that looks like it hasn't been occupied for years. She hesitates but, with the rain getting worse, decides to take her chances. Inside, the cabin is dark and cold, but surprisingly dry. Sarah sets up her camera, thinking she might as well take some shots of the storm from inside. The windows, streaked with rain, create an interesting distortion effect, and she begins to feel inspired. As she snaps picture after picture, she notices something strange. In the background of each photo, a blurry figure seems to be standing outside, just beyond the window. Sarah's curiosity gets the better of her, and she develops the photos using the portable darkroom equipment she always carries. The figures are clearer now, tall, shadowy forms that seem to be watching her. She brushes it off as a trick of the light, perhaps a reflection, and continues taking photos. But as the rain intensifies, so do the figures. They appear closer in each successive photo, almost as if they are moving toward her. Sarah starts to feel uneasy. She examines the latest batch of photos more closely and notices something horrifying: the figures aren't outside, they're in the room with her. Each photo shows them a little closer, a little more defined. Panic sets in as Sarah realizes she's been photographing something that isn't human. She frantically looks around the cabin, but there's no sign of anyone. She decides to leave, but when she tries to pack up her equipment, she can't find her camera. It's as if it's vanished. Desperate, she grabs her bag and rushes out the door into the pouring rain, but she slips and falls hard into a puddle. The rain is strangely thick, almost syrupy, and she struggles to get up. When she finally does, she looks back at the cabin and sees the shadowy figure standing at the window, watching her leave. Drenched and terrified, Sarah drives home, only to find her camera sitting on her doorstep. Confused, she picks it up and goes inside. She reviews the photos one last time, and what she sees makes her blood run cold. The figures are still there, but now they're in her house. The final photo shows one of them standing directly behind her. Sarah turns around, but no one is there. The rain outside has stopped, and everything is eerily quiet. She checks the camera again, but this time the photos are empty, no figures, no shadows. Just ordinary, rain-soaked landscapes. Relieved, she breathes out a sigh, but then the rain starts again, only this time, it's falling inside her house. The photos start to drip water, and Sarah watches in horror as the figures emerge from the photos, soaked and menacing, pulling her into the camera lens. Her last scream is muffled by the shutter click. The Hitchhiker summary: Tom is a long-haul trucker who's been driving for hours on end, trying to make his delivery on time. The storm has turned the highway into a blur of gray, and he's starting to feel the exhaustion set in. As he rounds a bend, he sees a figure by the side of the road, a man, drenched to the bone, thumbing for a ride. Against his better judgment, Tom pulls over. The hitchhiker gets in without a word, his face hidden beneath a dripping hood. Tom tries to make small talk, but the man remains silent, staring out the window. The only sound is the relentless pounding of the rain against the windshield. After a few miles, the hitchhiker finally speaks in a low, gravelly voice. He starts telling Tom about strange occurrences on nights just like this one, where people disappear without a trace, swallowed by the storm. The stories are unsettling, each more disturbing than the last. Tom tries to laugh it off, but there's something about the hitchhiker's tone that makes him uneasy. The man begins to describe a trucker who picked up a hitchhiker one stormy night, only to vanish soon after. The more he talks, the more Tom feels a growing sense of dread, as if the hitchhiker is describing his own fate. The rain intensifies, and Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightens. Suddenly, the hitchhiker goes silent again, and Tom realizes with a start that the man is no longer in the passenger seat. Confused, he pulls over, frantically looking around, but the hitchhiker is gone. It's as if he was never there. Tom checks the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the road behind him, but there's nothing but the rain-soaked highway. Feeling shaken, Tom decides to get back on the road and finish his route as quickly as possible. But as he drives, he can't shake the feeling that he's being watched. The radio crackles with static, and for a brief moment, Tom thinks he sees a shadow in the back seat. He glances over his shoulder, but the seat is empty. The miles drag on, and the rain doesn't let up. Tom feels himself slipping into a trance, lulled by the rhythmic thud of the wipers. He checks the clock on the dashboard, but it's frozen at the exact moment he picked up the hitchhiker. Something is very wrong. Tom's unease turns to terror when he glances in the mirror again and sees his own reflection in the passenger seat. It's not a mistake, his reflection is staring back at him from the hitchhiker's seat, a cold, dead-eyed version of himself. He slams on the brakes, but the truck doesn't stop. The reflection smiles grimly and begins to speak in the hitchhiker's voice, telling Tom that he's been driving this road for years, never realizing he was the one who disappeared. Tom's world spirals into darkness as he realizes that he's been dead all along, doomed to endlessly drive the same stormy highway, picking up passengers who are never really there.